It is time for another tier list. Since we're on to battleships now, I suspect more people will care than usual. On my destroyer tier list, I had someone ask me what the ship between Seattle and Montpelier was, to no fault of their own, but it did remind me that people will just randomly click on one of these videos since I didn't really specify any watch order. So I will reiterate once again that this is not a beginner tier list. If that is what you're looking for, look elsewhere. The information contained here is esoteric in nature, and 99% of people who think they get it probably don't. The jokes will not be explained, and things may happen for reasons that do not make sense at all. The least you could do is recognize every ship by the portrait of one of their skins before continuing watching this video. I'll give you an example. In the thumbnail of this video, I have featured Kearsarge, but that does not mean that I will be including her in the tier list. Stay tuned to find out. As for what each of the tiers that I have arbitrarily named S, A, B, C, and F mean, I will now explain. In the S tier are ships that will be considered in 95% of min-max situations. In the A tier, I have included ships that will see use in the remaining 5% of situations, meaning that they offer something unique that S tier ships don't. The B tier contains relatively strong ships that have their roles entirely covered by the ships in the two tiers above. C tier is the cute tier, which should be self-explanatory, and F tier is there just for a little spice. Even when I give a heads up for what F tier means, people still get mad. They just can't help themselves. Starting from the top, I will reveal the first two ships at once, which happen to both be the same ship. The allegations of me being an Ironblood hater may or may not have influenced this executive decision. Nah, just kidding. Bismarck Zwei does take first place, but the second ship I'm putting on here is Musashi. If you try to find criticism for Bismarck, there isn't really much. She has useful support with her black hole, strong faction buffs for relevant ships, and doesn't need to hog the flagship position to do her best work. Yeah, she only gets her strong barrage on half her salvos, but it's the odd half, so she'll never miss out on a stronger one like FTG does with her even and odd salvo buffs. Other than that, maybe you can say that her anti-air is low, so she'll get murdered by the planes in chapter 15. But in any case, she sets the standard for the most powerful battleship currently in the game. In close second is Musashi, who deals the most damage against heavy by a large margin, and has a significant 10% damage taken debuff for that armor type. She also increases your main fleet survivability by quite a bit, which is very helpful in chapter 14. Compared to Bismarck, there are things you can nitpick if you really wanted to. For instance, she does want the flagship position if possible, but it's not super important. She also deals pretty pathetic damage against light armor enemies by her own standards, mostly because her gun choices are extremely limited as of right now. Next up is Vanguard, who is the best force multiplier for battleships. If, for some reason, she is the only strong ship that you have, then she won't be carrying you as much of some of the other ships in this tier, but in a properly constructed battleship fleet, it isn't strange to see her contribute more than even Musashi in a lot of cases. Say what you want, but I think her personality is also extremely underrated. Next up is Kearsarge. Why did I put her here? I don't know, but it's my tier list so I can do what I want. I'm fairly certain that her damage output is going to be ahead of the ships that come after her, and at the same time she has a huge, almost 30% carrier damage buff as long as you use another USS main fleet ship alongside her. So I wouldn't be surprised if her placement here actually ends up being underrated. The design is also pristine. Just look at this masterpiece. Next up is New Jersey. There are a couple of things that you can nitpick about her now, seeing the potential that she could have from the ships that are in front of her. First, she doesn't have much AoE, making her quite mediocre in fights that involve multiple enemies, especially so when you remember the fact that half of her barrage targets a random enemy. Her barrage is a significant amount of her damage, but she herself has no means to set it up consistently, so it can whiff against faster moving enemies. Her faction buffs within the same fleet is laughable, giving 10% firepower only to battleships and battlecruisers, which doesn't include aviation battleships, obviously, so not only is the amount low, but there aren't even any good ships to choose from. However, it's not all bad news for New Jersey. She does deal more damage than Musashi against light armor enemies, and I've been thinking that in longer fights against medium armor enemies, she might have the potential to deal more as well. First, medium armor is where New Jersey and Musashi are the most competitive with each other. Since New Jersey's reload is closer to that of Bismarck and Vanguard, she can stay synced with them for a pretty long time, while Musashi would have to take some sort of reload boosting auxiliary like autoloader. The aux gap here could easily make the difference, not to mention that New Jersey would allow Bismarck to benefit from Vanguard and Plymouth's buffs, which will help her more than Musashi. So, even though she's a bit further down the list, it's only by 1 or 2 positions, so don't sleep on her. She is still excellent. Next up is FDG. She's not super reliable against single target like New Jersey, but instead is the queen of AoE spam, making her a premier option in campaign stages, mobs, and bosses alike. Her awkward reload buff also has no downsides in campaign stages where you want to desync. Her biggest weakness is that she provides no support, but despite that, she is still great. And we wrap up the S tier with Aviation. She is probably the weakest in this tier, but is the most effective ship in campaign boss fleets. Her cross-fleet barrage is the best in the game and greatly assists the performance of your mob fleet. And she has the highest uptime with just enough damage to be able to easily dispatch the annoying battleship mobs in Chapter 14 bosses. Next, we move on to the A tier. Reminder that A tier ships are not strictly stronger than B tier ships, but instead have something unique to offer so that they can find a use even if you have all of the S tier ships. First up is Seydlitz. She has an almost preload and respectable damage for a gold ship, but the real reason to use her is because she turns your Ironblood main fleet literally invincible, making her a fantastic option in Chapter 14 and against the Arbiter Hermit. Even if you have all the ships in S tier, if your damage isn't high enough due to levels, equipment, or fleet tech, and you can't DPS down the big threats in time, she will save your ass. Next up is Hood. Her damage is a bit on the lower side, but she is extremely consistent with her augment. Her reload buff allows for ships that would otherwise not be able to fire off an extra salvo do so, which is something that is not found in the S tier. She's also super good as a campaign flagship, whether it be mob or boss fleets, and is easily accessible in the metal exchange shop, making her overall the best battleship for new players. Next up are Bismarck and Mikasa. They offer significant buffs to the 2 strongest battleships in the game, and enable some themed fleets to be quite competitive, even when compared to more meta fleets. The most important aspect of their buffs is their reload buffs, which, like Hood, enable a lot of ships that otherwise wouldn't be able to squeeze out an extra salvo to do so. As you can see, Bismarck and Hood are now reunited. Where else can you find a tier list like this? Next up is Odin. She is not that good in boss fights, but is everywhere else. She adds what is the equivalent of a free destroyer with her aux guns, and her powerful timed barrage adds even more damage uptime on top of that. She doesn't care which position you put her in, so you can make a fleet with a carrier as your flagship and still get the flagship interception angle from her aux guns. Also, her torpedo damage reduction for the Vanguard is actually significant in Chapter 14, where torpedoes hit for 600 damage each. Next up are Flandre, Vittorio Veneto, and Richelieu. There are no preloads in S tier, so they have the potential to deal more damage within a short fight, which is why they're here. Flandre is in the front because she deals the most damage and doesn't need any specific position or composition. But if we get some good French or Italian ships, then Veneto and Richelieu will be more valuable. Next up is Nagato. She really has a hard time outputting more than the S tier ships and doesn't really work with them, but reload is reload. In any case, this is why she's on the lower side of A. Next up are Brunhilde and Monarch. Both of them provide significant slow support. Brunhilde has a 100% proc chance but is more single target focused, while Monarch has an AoE slow but only 70% chance to proc. There are other options outside of battleships such as A-Gear and Implacable, but they do offer something that the S tier ships do not. The last ship that barely makes the cut into A tier is Duke of York. Vanguard has pretty much entirely replaced her, but she has a slow and technically works better with carriers, which is an aspect of her that I think is underutilized. Now, we're on to the B tier. The first 3 ships are all pretty similar. There are very strong mob flagships that each have their own strengths and weaknesses. And in my opinion, there is no point bickering about their differences, because you should be using different fleets with each to cover up their weaknesses. For example, with Gascogne, she has a timed barrage so you can desync her guns, but her absolute damage output is not super high, so you can bring more ships that deal a lot of damage and worry less about desyncing to increase your damage uptime. Marco Polo has incredible damage against medium, but is pathetic against heavy, so bringing more torpedoes, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers will help deal with the enemies that she has trouble with. Rupi is essentially Odin but lacks some utility and locked to the flagship position, so you can replace her with Odin, but you cannot replace Odin with her. All 3 of these ships are more or less useless in boss fights, except for maybe Marco Polo against one single armor type, and they offer absolutely nothing over FDG, which is why I've put them in B tier. Next up is Nelson, who is similar to the previous 3 but a bit weaker because her barrage is completely stopped by shields, but she's very accessible to new players and a great option nonetheless. Next up is Tamaki, who is just a weaker New Jersey. Well, not that I've used her much, since she's a collab ship, but I'm willing to take a bet that she is weaker than New Jersey. The only reason I've included her and not any other collab ships in any of my tier lists is because, well, you can probably guess. Next up is Hao, who is a single target specialist with a reload buff, but it is a bit too weak to make a difference most of the time. But her personal damage is still fine. And we wrap up the B tier with Amagi, who has a bit of protection for your main fleet ships, but is definitely not on the level of Seydlitz if that is what you need, both in terms of offense and defense. Some ships that I did not mention that people will get mad about include the likes of Belarusia, some of the meta ships, Alabama, and so on, but quite frankly, I don't care. Use them if you want, but pretty much all of them offer nothing more than the first 3 ships in B tier anyway. And now, I reveal the C tier. Please buff John Bart. There are a couple of ships that I want to specifically mention, being Georgia and Champagne. I dislike Georgia because she's overrated, and Champagne because she's a time-wasting machine that deals half the damage of UVH. But I realized, what reason is there to needlessly hate on these ships and put them in F tier, when deep down I actually like their designs? So, to be the bigger person, I've opted to put them in the cute tier. So, that's pretty much it for the Battleship tier list. I hope that I have beaten the anti-Ironblood allegations with this one. No F tier this time, so everyone can sleep easy. Oh wait, there are a couple of ships that I forgot about.